Thank you for joining us on a really big special welcome to Dr. Tim Galsworthy from Lincoln Bishop University. And Tim is a lecturer in history and military history at Lincoln Bishop and is a specialist in modern US history. And that's very much the focus on the office research he presents today, his focus on politics and memory. And Tim's book, The Republican House Divided, Civil War Memory, Civil Rights, and the Transformation of the GOP, is available now from the University of South Carolina Press. And I think I'm very much looking forward to this. So, Tim, welcome to YSJ, albeit virtually, and over to you.
Well, good to see you. First of all, can you hear me okay, and can you see my screen okay as a starting point? Great. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for inviting me to deliver this talk. Thank you all so much for attending. So, the starting point for my research, the opening of my book, The Republican House Divided, is one of the defining images of the January 6th Capitol insurrection in 2021. That is the image you can see here of an insurrectionist carrying a Confederate battle flag into the US Capitol. Considered in long historical context, the sight of a rioter carrying the Confederate flag to support a Republican president, the leader of the party of Lincoln, who's played a vital role in defeating the rebellious Southern states during the American Civil War, seems hard to credit. It is, however, wholly consistent with the contemporary GOP, Grand Old Party, which is a shorthand for the Republican Party. And that is one I want to try and explain in my book. How and why did the Republican Party get from being the party of Abraham Lincoln, the political arm of the Union war effort during the Civil War of the 1860s, to being the comfortable home of those who wave Confederate battle flags and defend Confederate monuments? And it's my contention that one potential answer lies in the political changes wrought during the Civil Rights era, with a particular focus on how Republicans engaged with the historical memories of the Civil War. Indeed, I argue that during the 1960s and 70s, rival Republican factions utilized competing and contested Civil War memories as they fought intra-party battles over the GOP's positions on civil rights, African Americans, and the White South, and in their attempts to mobilize conflicting voters. Ultimately, Republicans used Civil War memories instrumentally to support, oppose, and shape the GOP's transformation into a racially conservative party during the Civil Rights era. So, in my book, The Republican House Divided, I assess the relationships between Republicans and Civil War memory between roughly 1960 and the mid 1970s, a period covering the Civil War centennial, landmark moments in the civil rights struggle, a series of important presidential and midterm elections, and lots more. I've put the contents page for the book on the screen here so you can get a sense of the coverage. While obviously I cannot run through the whole book in the time we have today, I do want to run through some of my key findings about the Republican Party and Civil War memory in the 1960s and 1970s, hopefully leaving time for some questions as well. I'm not going to dive into the 1960 presidential election in any great detail. If you want to know more about my analysis of this election, it's in the book. I also have an article about this election specifically in Presidential Studies Quarterly. But for our purposes, the key points to grasp are that the GOP was broadly united in 1960, both politically and in their engagement with Civil War memory. However, that unanimity and consensus was shattered in the aftermath of Richard Nixon's narrow loss to the Democratic presidential nominee John F. Kennedy. Indeed, after 1960, civil rights divided the GOP as it split the nation. In the immediate aftermath of the party's 1960 reversal, the GOP was polarized between its progressive wing, associated with New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and racially liberal republicanism on the one hand, and the Republican right on the other, which coalesced around Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Rockefeller and his progressive allies argued that Nixon's error was in appealing to the South at the expense of the urban North in 1960. They called on the party to court black support and embrace civil rights. Conversely, Goldwater and his supporters criticized Nixon for prioritizing metropolitan voters ahead of conservative positions primed to win Southern converts. And it is crucial that we understand these partisan divisions within their wider context. Between 1961 and 65, Americans were marking the centennial of the Civil War, and America was still grappling with the same problems it had faced 100 years earlier: racial inequality, the federal government's role, states' rights. These unresolved issues led many Americans to compare contemporary events to those from the Civil War era, as well as increasing the political value of Civil War memories to rival Republicans. This was also, of course, a crucial moment in the nation's civil rights story. The early 1960s were the period of freedom rides, the Birmingham Campaign, the March on Washington, and much more. In the Civil War era, the GOP associated itself definitively with black freedom. A century later, rival Republican factions used Civil War memories extensively to debate their party's relationship with civil rights, African Americans, and the white South. And in the early 1960s, a crucial group in this story comes from below the Mason-Dixon line, from the South. In campaigns that threatened a century of Democratic dominance, Southern Republicans endeavored to boost their electoral chances, realign Southern politics, and simultaneously transform the national GOP into a conservative organization attractive to white Southerners. Principally, they used Civil War memory to repudiate the GOP's negative image as the party of Northern aggression and radical reconstruction, while also puncturing Southern Democrats' standing as the defenders of white supremacy and segregation. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds of this, but it's crucial to understand that after the Civil War, after the end of Reconstruction, the South is almost not entirely, but pretty uniformly Democratic. It's called the Solid South. And a lot of the reason for that is this dislike of the Republican Party for their role in the Civil War, but also their efforts to foster interracial democracy during Reconstruction. So that's what Southern Republicans in the 1960s are butting up against. This near century tradition of voting Democratic, this near century tradition of hating the Republican Party. Southern Republican candidates like William Workman in South Carolina, James Martin in Alabama, and Rubel Phillips in Mississippi invoke memories of the Civil War and Reconstruction to, on the one hand, reframe the GOP as an ally to white Southerners, stressing how far the party had changed since the 1860s and 1870s. Alongside this, they look to puncture the standing of Southern Democrats as the surest defenders of segregation. And they use an array of memories from directly associating themselves with kind of pro-Confederate memory like flags and music, but also really trying to stress to voters in these Southern states, we are not the party we were a century ago. The Republican Party has changed. Therefore, you can now trust us when it comes to race and segregation. Ultimately, all three of those Southern Republicans would lose their elections in 1962 and 63. Nevertheless, their strong showings, Phillips received 38% of the vote, Workman 43%, and Martin 49%. These strong showings in solidly Democratic states showed the potential of success for racially conservative republicanism and convinced national members of the GOP right that attracting white Southerners was no longer impossible. Now, within that national GOP right, the most influential conservative Republican was Barry Goldwater, a strident advocate of small government, fiscal conservatism, and states' rights. During the early 1960s, his supporters spent their time organizing at the grassroots. A dedicated band of activists captured the GOP from the bottom up. Dubbed the Chicago Group, they quietly filled the party's local and state level structures with Goldwater supporters, giving him a massive delegate lead before the 1964 race even started. GOP conservatives argued that Goldwater's states' rights conservatism would attract substantial white Southern support in 1964, with the Arizonan himself spending the early 60s flattering the sensibilities of Dixie reactionaries, even going as far as calling for a constitutional amendment to overturn the Brown decision or criticizing President Kennedy's actions to ensure integration at the University of Mississippi. While Goldwater was a hero to Republican conservatives, he was the bête noir of their intra-party rivals. Liberal Republicans, yes, they were once a thing, resisted the GOP's racially conservative transformation determinedly, if ultimately unsuccessfully. They pressed fellow Republicans to align themselves with the civil rights movement rather than profit from white backlash against it. Progressives used Civil War memory as a key rhetorical prop to contest burgeoning Southern and Goldwaterite republicanism and articulate their alternative pro-civil rights vision. White and black progressive Republicans such as Grant Reynolds or Nelson Rockefeller, in direct opposition to GOP conservatives, celebrated their party's Civil War heritage. They employed what I term a Republican emancipationist memory narrative, presenting the end of slavery under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln as the party's original mission, in order to champion a racially liberal present-day GOP aligned with the Black freedom struggle. So, we enter the 1964 election with the battle lines clearly drawn. Rockefeller and Goldwater, both declared candidates for the Republican presidential nomination, offered wildly different visions for their party, especially in the field of civil rights. They and their supporters sought to champion their politics and policies through the instrumental use of Civil War memory. Just as he had done throughout the decade, Rockefeller presented himself and progressive republicanism as firmly in step with the GOP's traditions dating back to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. At the same time, he painted Goldwater as an aberration from the Republican Party's heritage, as an aberration of Lincoln, because of his reactionary positions, principally on civil rights. When Goldwater's campaign faltered, other progressive Republicans entered the fray, most notably Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton, who likewise framed themselves as in step with Lincoln and Goldwater as out of step with Lincoln. The Arizonan and his supporters did not take these charges lying down, however. Throughout 1964, Goldwater and Goldwater Rights framed the senator and his conservative ideology as actually more consistent with Lincoln's views than those of GOP progressives. However, Goldwater was more strident in the use of Civil War memories when courting white Southern support, seeking to tap the pro-Confederate sentiments endemic in white Southern culture. Alongside memory nods, Goldwater also helped secure white Southern support by stridently opposing and voting against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Republicans arrived at their 1964 National Convention in San Francisco, almost certain that Goldwater would win the nomination. GOP progressives tried to make a show of defiance, challenging the party's conservative platform, taking part in a civil rights rally in the city, making defiant speeches during the convention, again frequently presenting Goldwater and his racial conservatism as disgracing the Republican heritage of Lincoln and the Civil War. It was all to no avail. Goldwater received 883 votes on the first ballot, more than enough to win the nomination comfortably. Unsurprisingly, Southern state delegations were especially firm supporters of Goldwater. Indeed, it was South Carolina's all-white delegation that gave Goldwater the votes he needed to secure victory. One journalist commentated that it was, quote, appropriate symbolism that this melancholy moment in the history of Abraham Lincoln's party should be signalized by the joyous yells of a racist Southern battalion. After the convention, as progressives licked their wounds, Goldwater and his allies set off on the campaign trail to win the presidency. Civil War memory proved to be a key tool in Goldwater's rhetorical arsenal. In particular, Goldwater used historical references to promote his law and order platform. He used the speech in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's hometown and resting place, to rebuke the civil rights movement's perceived excesses. The senator berated those who, in his words, seek redress to grievances through lawlessness, criticizing what he called, quote, disregard for law and order, declaring that he joined hands across the years with those Republicans who built our party. Goldwater claimed that his states' rights, law and order platform had transformed the GOP into what he called the party of freedom once again, just as Lincoln helped make it a party of liberation during the Civil War. However, many of Goldwater's white Southern supporters used very different historical allusions to champion the GOP nominee and his platform. Rather than portraying Goldwater as Lincoln's legatee, his devoted backers instead framed him as a fitting heir to their Confederate ancestors. The party of our fathers is dead. Those who took its name are engaged in another reconstruction, this time not only of the South, but of the entire nation, declared South Carolina's Democratic Senator Strom Thurmond, as he announced in a mid-September televised address that he was switching parties and backing Goldwater. Goldwater continued to reference the past most effectually as he pursued white Southern support. In appearances across the region, Goldwater venerated bygone white supremacist Democrats. On September the 17th, the day after his party switch, Thurmond introduced Goldwater at a raucous rally in Greenville, South Carolina. There is nothing left of the principles that your fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers stood for in the Democratic Party, Goldwater told listeners. Here, using historical memories to encourage white Southerners to renounce their generations-old partisan prejudice as the boisterous crowd waved Confederate flags with gusto. On November the 3rd, Goldwater was defeated comprehensively in the presidential election. Lyndon Johnson won 44 states, 486 electoral college votes, and 61% of the popular vote. An absolute landslide, still one of the biggest in American history. But Goldwater succeeded where many predicted he would, the Deep South. He carried Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. And he won handsomely in these states, building on recent impressive showings by local GOP candidates, capturing 59% of the vote in South Carolina, 69% in Alabama, and a staggering 87% in Mississippi. And these are states where a Republican was an outcast just a few years before. This election was one of critical realignment, 1964. Many white Southerners, motivated by the two parties' changing positions on civil rights, migrated to the GOP. By rupturing the Democratic Solid South, Goldwater reorientated the GOP towards racial conservatism and white Southerners. The future of Republican politics was forged in 1964. Despite his rout, Goldwater's campaign assured that the GOP's transformation into a racially conservative, Southern-focused party was marked, if not total. By tying the GOP to white backlash and Southern reactionaries, Goldwater and his supporters helped determine their party's relationship with racial politics for the rest of the 1960s and for decades to come. In the years immediately after 1964, internal Republican debates were informed significantly by the intense discord occupying the nation as a whole. The passage of the watershed 1965 Voting Rights Act resulted in a new phase in the Black freedom struggle. Many African American organizations turned their gaze toward racial injustices above the Mason-Dixon line. The advent of Black power was also perceived by many onlookers as an increased militancy among civil rights activists. Police brutality and unequal living conditions fostered racial uprisings for successive summers, which in turn cemented the issue of Black lawlessness in the minds of many politicians and voters. The Civil War remained a key reference point as Republicans helped shape the nation's new racial politics, negotiating civil rights demands and the white backlash against them. Black Republicans were particularly vocal in the wake of the party's 1964 reversal. Although the overwhelming majority of African Americans identified as Democrats, only 6% of Black voters had cast their ballots for Goldwater. This small remaining band of Black partisans was determined to instill its own version of pro-civil rights republicanism. Black Republicans utilized civil war memories extensively in their efforts to foster a racially liberal post-Goldwater GOP, expressing authentic connections with the party's 19th century traditions. Some progressive white Republicans, such as Nelson Rockefeller, joined Black Republicans in calling for a racially liberal GOP, which could, they argue, live up to Lincoln's mantle. Black Republicans and their white allies achieved landmark success with the election of Edward Brooke as Massachusetts Senator, the first Black senator since Reconstruction in 1966, which seemed to suggest a change in racial tenor in their party. Yet, it should be noted that some Black Republican activists became skeptical about such laudatory Lincolnian references, believing that these appeals did little to heal the breach with African American voters, which had been caused by Goldwaterism. In the aftermath of 1964 as well, many Southern Republicans took heart from Goldwater's success with white Southern voters. Figures such as Strom Thurmond and Albert Watson, both Democrat to Republican switches in South Carolina, used lost cause, pro-Confederate sentiments in their efforts to cement their region's realignment. Yet other Southern Republicans, notably Rubel Phillips in Mississippi, toned down their rhetoric, seeing the need to moderate their politics and their engagement with Civil War memory after the 1965 Voting Rights Act began fostering an integrated Southern electorate. Announcing his campaign in May 1967, where he's running for governor again in Mississippi, Phillips declared that he wanted to, quote, convince the people of Mississippi that we should quit worrying about how our grandfathers would want us to vote and start worrying whether our grandchildren will regret that we voted as we did. He repeated this frame, which relied on shared understanding of how Mississippi's democratic loyalty was rooted in Reconstruction throughout 1967. Another politician who altered his political appeals and resulted in engagement with historical memories was Richard Nixon. Goldwater's decisive defeat offered the former vice president a route back to party leadership, and Nixon restyled Republican racial conservatism. He aimed to expand beyond Goldwater's southern base by harnessing national white resentment about urban rebellions and black power, alongside campus radicalism and protests against the Vietnam War. Ever the pragmatist, Nixon adapted his use of Civil War memories as he advanced his more right-wing platform and inserted himself as the frontrunner for the 1968 presidential nomination. In addition to appearing in all 11 former Confederate states to woo white Southern support, which he believed was crucial to victory in 1968, Nixon also embraced law and order rhetoric during this period. Law and order appeals served as coded language to win votes from white Northerners and Southerners who were uneasy about civil rights, urban unrest, and changing social mores, but without expressing blatant racial prejudice. Unlike progressives who cited Lincoln to promote racially liberal republicanism, Nixon invoked the 16th president to cast himself as a law and order champion. Writing in Reader's Digest in 1967, Nixon railed against, quote, not only a growing tolerance of lawlessness, but an increasing public acceptance of civil disobedience. There can be no right to revolt in this society, no right to demonstrate outside the law, and in Lincoln's words, no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law. Sorry, 1 second. Apologies. And thanks to his activism in the aftermath of 1964, his long-standing ties to party operatives, and the divided nature of the GOP, Nixon was very much the frontrunner for the Republican nomination in 1968. This election took place in a social and political maelstrom of anti-war protests, campus unrest, political assassinations, and continued racial tensions. In that context, Nixon's message of law and order resonated with figures inside and outside the Republican Party. Nelson Rockefeller belatedly entered the nomination race after Martin Luther King's assassination, making a final, defiant, and unsuccessful charge behind the banner of progressive republicanism. Some on the right also mooted California Governor Ronald Reagan as a potential nominee. However, there was never any real threat to Nixon's ascent. Nixon sought the presidency in '68 on a conservative platform tied intimately to racial issues. He continued using Lincolnian memories in coded appeals to white voters who felt alienated from racial and generational changes. Nixon pronounced his determination to restore law and order, pitting ostensibly law-abiding and coded white citizens, who he later dubbed the silent majority, against civil rights radicals, urban rioters, student leftists, and anti-war protesters. Appearing in Chicago in early September, soon after the tumultuous Democratic National Convention in that city, he juxtaposed his firm anti-crime positions with the disorderly protesters and disarrayed Democrats that the world had seen in Chicago. This is a nation of laws, Nixon declared, and as Abraham Lincoln has said, no one is above the law and no one is below the law. And we're going to have the law, and Americans should remember that if we're going to have law and order. He deployed the same Lincolnian reference during an October speech in Dayton, Ohio, underscoring his determination to, in Nixon's words, restore in this country respect for law and order. In many respects, the divided nature of 1968 America produced a highly divided political picture. Alongside Nixon as the Republican nominee, there was also Democratic nominee Hubert Humphrey, LBJ's vice president, who was hampered by his association with an unpopular president and an unpopular Vietnam War, as well as third-party independent George Wallace. While having some purchase outside the former Confederacy, the former Alabama governor was very much a last gasp of defiance from Southern segregationists, one that forced or perhaps enabled Nixon and the Republicans to moderate their appeals in the South, largely dropping, at least temporarily, the pro-Confederate references that had come to define Southern republicanism when they were faced with a truly unreconstructed rebel. Ultimately, Nixon won the presidency with 32 states and 301 electoral college votes. While as expected, Wallace triumphed in the Deep South, Nixon held South Carolina, thanks mainly to Strom Thurmond's support. Strenuous campaigning by Thurmond and also Nixon's running mate Spiro Agnew helped Nixon carry Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia too. Nixon received approximately 10% of the black vote. Despite being a 4% improvement on Goldwater's showing, the schism between African Americans and the GOP persisted. Nixon's decision to pursue law and order appeals and courtship of white Southerners extensively convinced most black voters that the GOP was a lost cause. So, for the first time since JFK's inauguration in 1961, the US had a Republican in the White House. It is my contention that the GOP remained on a racially conservative trajectory during the Nixon years, thanks to the actions of the administration and wider party actors, and that Civil War memory endured as a crucial, contested element of intra-party battles as rival Republicans both furthered and resisted this course. While GOP campaigns in the region had predominantly lost the segregationist and unreconstructed tenor of the early 1960s, historical memories remain symbolically and practically useful for Southern Republicans. GOP partisans understood that some white Southerners still remained hesitant about the party of Lincoln and Reconstruction, especially at a state and local level. Therefore, they therefore referenced the Civil War era to again reassure doubters that their party, just like the once beloved Democratic Party, had changed in the last century. Most Southern Republican candidates pushed voters to embrace the future in place of a hostile past, relying on apparent moderation and coded language rather than openly racialized appeals. For example, Trent Lott, who won a congressional seat in Mississippi in 1972, counseled voters that, quote, "My father and grandfather were Democrats, but parties change just like people and countries change," as he encouraged typical Mississippians, in his words, to step away from their historically rooted allegiances. Yet other Southern Republicans remain willing to rely on more racially explicit appeals to the Confederacy and Reconstruction in their campaign efforts. For example, in his 1970 bid for South Carolina governor, Albert Watson dismissed government largesse by the state's Democratic governor as comparable to, quote, "the days when the carpetbaggers and their radical cohorts stripped South Carolina of her wealth," while he also celebrated the playing of the Confederate anthem Dixie at his rallies. Concurrent with Southern Republicans utilizing Civil War era allusions in their political strategies, national GOP leaders likewise perceived emotionally charged historical references as a key instrument to support their own ambitions. Although abjuring overt racism in favor of coded conservatism, Nixon unambiguously tailored policy decisions and presidential rhetoric to advance a Southern strategy. He courted favour with white Southerners by attempting, unsuccessfully, to name two conservative Southern justices to the Supreme Court, appointing Southerners to important administration positions, and especially by opposing mandated busing to achieve school desegregation. Civil War references were a key part of Nixon and Vice President Agnew's rhetorical Southern strategy. During the 1960s, Southern Republicans had been the principal employers of pro-Confederate memories. Although the National Party had sometimes taken advantage of lost cause sentiments, the language largely originated from Southern Republicans themselves, Thurmond, James Martin, etc. Ensconced in the White House, Nixon and Agnew embraced heartedly the pro-Confederate language long used by Southern Republicans. The apogee of this embrace was Agnew's May 1970 appearance at Stone Mountain, Georgia. He spoke at the dedication of massive stone reliefs of Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. The monument had been a dream of heritage groups for more than 50 years and was highly controversial, especially given the Second Klan's founding at Stone Mountain in 1915. Agnew celebrated the Confederate luminaries' what he called loyalty, dignity, and honor. He repeated common lost cause myths, including the claim that Lee opposed slavery and opposed secession, depicting the secessionist triumvirate as model Americans. Any reconciliationist nods, as he called on Americans to set aside the evils of sectionalism once and for all, were drowned out by his full-throated praise of Lee, Jackson, and Davis. Agnew even left time to invoke a false equivalency, which reflected his and Nixon's wider appeals to white Southern victimhood. Just as the South cannot afford to discriminate against any of its own people, the rest of the nation cannot afford to discriminate against the South. Nixon joined his vice president in embracing lost cause memories as part of his efforts to entice white Southerners and further detoxify the GOP in Southern eyes. A feat perhaps demonstrated by the fact that every single Southern state voted for Nixon in his 1972 re-election bid. During a May 1971 visit to West Point, he informed the superintendent of the US Army Service Academy that they should have a statue honoring Confederates, a suggestion resisted successfully by black cadets, despite pressure from the White House. Now, there were, of course, other figures at play in the Republican Party during the Nixon years. In my book, I lay out a shift in black republicanism, with pro-Nixon right-wing African Americans reimagining Civil War memory to champion the president's conservative civil rights policies, which centered on kind of black capitalism and self-help. I also note that there was a defiant band of progressive Republicans opposed to Nixon who, continuing their efforts from the 1960s, relied on historical references to champion pro-civil rights republicanism. However, these progressives dwindled in influence. Indeed, the idea of liberal Republicans today is ridiculous, and they could not sway the racially conservative tide of their party. If you'd like to know more, I guess you'll have to buy the book. Now, while it's important to eschew presentism, I firmly believe that my research offers valuable insights into the Republican Party of today, too. On the one hand, the contemporary GOP can be fairly described as the political arm of the lost cause. In June 2021, 120 House Republicans voted against removing Confederate statues from Congress. Yet lost cause memories are today not the sole preserve of Southern Republicans. Pro-Confederate sentiments or defenses of Confederate statues and symbols have become a useful wedge issue nationwide. Southern and non-Southern GOP politicians alike view Confederate totems as an effective rallying point for white conservatives, pitting them against liberal or woke antagonists who supposedly denigrate American history. Liberal, woke, in speech marks. Of the 120 House Republicans who opposed removing Confederate statues in Congress, over half were from states outside the former Confederacy. Donald Trump has also hitched his wagon firmly to the defense of Confederate markers, aiming to provoke emotional reactions from supporters on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. Immediately following the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, the president's speeches were peppered with indignant claims that liberals wanted to remove statues of both Confederates and figures like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. During the Civil Rights era, in a period where they became major intra-party players, Southern Republicans established Confederate memories within the GOP on a major scale. As white politicians and voters migrated to the GOP, Southern converts brought their pro-Confederate sentiments with them. And when politicians, national politicians like Nixon and Goldwater, played on the white backlash to civil rights as they sought Southern support, they exploited the memories already prominent in the region's politics and culture. During the Nixon era, primarily through Nixon and Agnew's speech-making, GOP leaders normalized the presence of lost cause sentiments in Republican appeals on a national level. Thus, the overwhelmingly white, Southern, and racially conservative party of Lincoln became an incubator for the lost cause. And yet, contemporary Republicans are also loath to abandon Abraham Lincoln. Trump, for instance, has stressed repeatedly his communality with Lincoln, portraying himself as Lincoln's legatee and claiming he has done more for African Americans than any president since the Great Emancipator. In this respect, Trump encapsulates the GOP's complex contemporary relationship with Civil War memory. While Republicans are reluctant to surrender Lincoln, even if their Lincolnian illusions are entirely hollow, their party is now the logical home for Americans who proudly wave rebel flags or defend Confederate statues in the name of heritage, not hate. To conclude, then, during the 1960s and 1970s, right-wing Republicans transformed the GOP into a racially conservative party that was overwhelmingly white, increasingly Southern, and increasingly reliant on anti-black resentment on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. Yet their success was not inevitable. Republicans of all stripes used Civil War memories as key political tools to support, oppose, and ultimately shape this transformation. Rival Republicans, as they battled over the GOP's strategies towards civil rights, African Americans, and the White South, employed Civil War memory to fight intra-party battles and sell competing visions of republicanism to their party and nation. Politicians, GOP activists, and ordinary Americans sought usable pasts and viewed historical memories as valuable instruments of politics. The path from civil rights era republicanism to the contemporary party of Trump is complex. However, the intra-party conflicts and partisan changes of the 1960s and 1970s GOP helped forge the conditions enabling an insurrectionist to carry a Confederate battle flag into the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, in support of a Republican president without any concern for historical contradiction. So thank you very much for coming along today. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to questions, comments, further conversation. I've put here, you can buy the book. You can buy the book with a discount code. It's also available as an ebook. It's also available as an audiobook. I am my own publicist in this regard. But thank you so much for coming along today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Tim. That's fantastic. I really enjoyed that, and I've got lots of questions. But I won't hog the floor completely. So, but whilst people are thinking, just refining their questions, I will ask one. If you do want to ask a question, you can put it in there's a Q&A chat. There's a Q&A should be on your screens with a question mark. Or if you want to, you can be. I can allow you to talk. I have the control, the power to do that. But be aware that we are recording this, so if you don't want to be on film on YouTube forever asking a question, you can just type your question. And so for me, then I've got so many, but because I really enjoyed it, it just got my brain really going. And that is came out Abraham Lincoln. Yes, I remember years ago watching a documentary, Abraham Lincoln, Hero or Villain, and it kind of like it's great to watch, but also it's a great introduction, I think, to students about the debate about Lincoln. That actually is not necessarily an American saint, if you will. There is actually another side to Abraham Lincoln that people don't like Lincoln. So, for example, in terms of like authoritarianism, that what we have now, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, for example. The extent of Reagan's the brain. So the extent that Lincoln, of course, was wasn't racist. I mean, obviously, he's the president. Did freed the slaves. Of course, he didn't. Obviously, he meant to free the enslaved. But and obviously, if you read the Lincoln Douglas debates, Lincoln says what would, in terms of presidency, and what we think today would be absolutely horrific sort of stuff, but obviously very standard at the time. So in terms of Lincoln, then it's almost like how he used history, that there's like a good Lincoln and there's like a bad Lincoln. As Lincoln would say, the better angels of our nature. So Lincoln was possible to be used by the Republicans of the South, but also in the north of the country as well, more progressives in the north. So can you say a bit more about the critics of Lincoln, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. In that I refer to him quite often as malleable and plastic in the book, because there's a sense that Lincoln is everywhere and nowhere, in that if you're a Republican, pretty much you're going to claim Lincoln to some extent. He has the usefulness of basically saying everything at various points at various times, right? You can take and what's really interesting is you get from kind of progressives within and beyond the Republican Party sort of using a very emancipationist memory of Lincoln the Emancipator. But then you also get when kind of some of Goldwater's defenders are defending his opposition to civil rights, they're like, well, Lincoln's a segregationist. So Goldwater being a segregationist, even though he wasn't, but anyway, Goldwater being conservative on civil rights, well, that's fully in step with Lincoln. he's everywhere and nowhere. It's what David Donald called getting right with Lincoln, in the sense that if you're a politician in America, particularly if you're a Republican politician in America, you have to use Lincoln in some way. And I think it's the sense that there's so much you can take from Lincoln, right? He's claimed by everyone from socialists to segregationists. He says plenty of really interesting stuff about labor and capital in letter exchanges he has with Karl Marx during the Civil War. So he's been claimed by communist socialists within the US and beyond as being, well, he's speaking about labor and capital and valuing labor over capital. So he can be claimed that way. I won't go into, wartime measures, and it's debatable to the extent to which Lincoln's an authoritarian. But I think it speaks to more than anything that when individuals within that I'm studying and beyond, whenever people talk about the past, they're not doing it for neutral reasons, and they're picking the most usable past. They're using the past in the best way to support them. Are they necessarily thinking critically about Lincoln? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but they're picking the best memories, the best versions of Lincoln, and the best versions of other figures and other moments in the Civil War to suit their purposes.
Brilliant, thank you. So, because Lincoln's proven that you can be all things to all men all of the
You
time.
can, and
Um,
you have to. If you're a Republican, you're going to quote Lincoln. That's just a fact, even today.
yeah. It's interesting. It was up until fairly recently. The Thomas Jefferson dinner was one of the most popular dinners for Democrats, to
That's
attend.
the Jefferson Jackson dinner. It's the
Yeah,
big
but
one
of
for it's
course,
big.
that's much more a problematic legacy as well now.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm always intrigued by, I remember an interview that AOC did a few years ago being like, oh, we need to get back the kind of FDR party. It's like, well, the FDR party abided with segregation in the South. So there's never, this is also the whole kind of where I think make America great again as a concept is appealing but meaningless. Because at what
Mm.
point was anything great in the past? Like there's
Yeah,
never any kind of universally agreed upon great moment, right? I think Britain is like the 2012 Olympics. Like that's the thing right now what everyone goes back to. And I'm like, well, I must have missed the austerity that had been going on for 2 years. So, there's no perfect moment at any point in any national history, but everyone's searching for it.
yeah. I miss the 90s, to be honest, as well. Um, But okay, just got a couple of questions. One is from my excellent colleague Robbie Barnes, saying, "Thanks, Tim. I appreciate that you're focused on domestic affairs, but how important a role did foreign policy play
Mm.
in the reshaping of the Republican Party in this period? I assume many of the liberal Republicans also tending to be the internationalist Republicans. So how did their internationalism contribute to them being sidelined?"
Yeah, it's a really good question. I will admit the book is more domestic. I will admit that is my focus and my interest um and where I think the kind of the meat of the coconut is. But I think there's two things to it. Kind of the international aspect is the fact that Vietnam and different policies about Vietnam and Vietnam protests becomes a really key way in which Nixon presents himself as on the side of ordinary Americans, quote unquote, who don't really necessarily like the Vietnam War, but they really don't like the protests, and it's kind of finding the way through that. But yes, the kind of I broadly agree with E. James Wrightsley's separation of the Republican Party into kind of four main factions, which is from working from kind of most conservative to least, in that you have kind of conservatives, which is kind of Goldwater, states' rights. You've got stalwarts who are conservative, but they're kind of small town Protestant, your Everett Dirksons of the world, who are conservative, but they're not going to rock the boat. They just want to be loyal Republicans. Then you get kind of moderates who are kind of Eisenhower, and they are probably the most internationalist in the sense that lots of the main reason Eisenhower gets into the race in 1952 is because he opposes Taft's kind of isolationist approach to foreign affairs. And then you have just to the left of the right of those is progressives, liberals, people like Rockefeller. But yes, they are fundamentally more internationalist. Um, some of the key figures on the moderate and progressive side are people like Henry Cabot Lodge, who had been Kennedy's ambassador to Vietnam and then comes back in 1964 to sort of be a possible nominee, but then becomes a kind of leading anti-Goldwater speaker. Rockefeller himself has kind of foreign policy, foreign affairs experience in Latin America. So yes, they are fundamentally more internationalist. Elements of the kind of conservatives and stalwarts are more isolationist. But in saying that as well, Dirksen, as Senate Minority Leader, so the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, is an erstwhile ally of Johnson when it comes to Vietnam. So it's certainly a very different Republican Party from the 30s and even the late 40s, 50s, where there is kind of more isolationist tendencies. But I would broadly agree that if you're the kind of liberal, moderate wing of the party in the Eisenhower mold, is much more comfortable talking about international affairs. Perhaps, but obviously Nixon still has foreign policy and stuff as well. So that's an answer to a foreign policy question from someone who focuses on domestic stuff, I'm afraid.
That's a great answer. I think there's been a thumbs up, so I assume that was from Robbie. There's another couple of questions coming in. They beat me too. I've got a question, but I'm not out of time. So I've got another one from an anonymous attendee. After Trump leaves office, what direction do you think the Republican Party will go in?
And how long have you got? I mean, I actually think I think the Republican Party is actually I think a Republican civil war is coming fundamentally, in that Trump has basically got till the November midterms. The Republicans will probably lose the House in the midterms. He can't run a third time without changing the Constitution, and he doesn't have the numbers in Congress even now to make that change happen because there are enough Republicans that wouldn't go for it. So he is post November a lame duck. And I think it will come. How does he adjust to that? Because the donors, the party bosses, as it were, they're not thinking about Trump anymore. They're thinking about 2028 and who's going to be the nominee. And I think the battle will come between kind of Trump will want to, if he can't be the nominee, he'll want to anoint the nominee. And he'll probably want them to have the surname Trump or maybe Kushner. And then kind of arrayed against that will be Vance, and where I think a lot of the money will go, which is from Peter Thiel and others, which is to Vance. Now, I don't actually think that's an ideological clash, really. It's more about control of the party. So I think that's where it's going. So I think it's going to be a very active, and I think as well, what happens next is we've seen a lot of attempts from Republicans up and down the party to replicate Trumpism without Trump, and it just doesn't work because Trump, whatever people's views of him, is an incredibly brilliant campaigner. You know, he's won two presidential elections, run pretty close in a third. He attracts people who don't vote. He attracts people that wouldn't necessarily be the most obvious supporters of the Republican Party. And he is although actually he's quite unpopular at the moment, but Trump is normally more popular than Trumpism. And I'm not convinced that Vance or Don Jr. or pick your Republican will be able to run Trumpism without Trump. So I think there's lots going to happen, and I think a Republican civil war is coming, and I think how Trump reacts to accepting the reality that he can't be the nominee in 28, or if he doesn't accept that reality, how do other Republicans navigate that? Is what's coming in the short term. In the long term, I'm a historian. I'm much more comfortable talking about the past than the present. Who knows? But I don't think you're going to see a resurgence of Rockefeller or Eisenhower style republicanism. Put it that way.
Thank you. So again, I've got a follow-up question about I'll have to maybe another time, but I got a question now from Neil saying I hadn't realised that the transition of the GOP was so sudden and so recent. Maybe radicalism inevitably breeds reaction. My question is whether there were any portents to the transition of the GOP in the 1930s and 1950s.
Okay, so I think while I kind of have pitched out kind of 64, I do think it's a key pivot point, and I do think the 60s and 70s are this key moment of transition for the GOP. I don't think it's a case of it happened instantaneously. I don't think that. The 1930s, you do see some seeds being sown in the folks like Alf Landon and others are kind of diametrically opposed to that's just my Alan sneaking in across the background. They are diametrically opposed to the New Deal. So you do get quite strident opposition to the New Deal state and kind of New Deal liberalism. So I think that's an important, which sets the seeds for everything else. And I think the 50s, I mean, my current research that I'm moving on to at the moment is Eisenhower and kind of Eisenhower's relationship with the South, mainly as a post-president, but I am spending some time thinking about the 50s as well. And I think Eisenhower is actually, I think he's more conservative than is sometimes appreciated. I think he sows the seeds for Republican growth in the South, kind of operationally, and he is willing to tap some of these white Southern sensibilities. So he goes in something I'm looking at the minute. He goes in 1952 and campaigns in Columbia, South Carolina. He talks about the Confederate monument in front of him. He gives this kind of very celebration of Confederate heroism. And there's the famous fact that the band strike up Dixie. And Eisenhower stands and he says, "I always stand when they play that song," and the crowd goes wild. So you can start to see the early seeds of this willingness to play on Civil War memory. Um, but I do think there's something significant about the 60s and 70s in terms of obviously the civil rights movement didn't just emerge out of nowhere. Again, that's a longer story going back to New Deal, World War II. Some people put it even earlier, 1950s is a key moment. But these kind of headline moments happen in the midst of the Civil War centennial. And it's no surprise in that sort of context that these big questions about kind of big partisan changes start to happen. I should also say that it's a long-term process too, right? I mean, in the 60s and also with Eisenhower in the 50s, but particularly with Goldwater and Nixon, white Southerners get more comfortable voting Republican. At a presidential level, they repeat that with Reagan. The only real Democrat presidential nominees who've got any votes in the South are Carter and Clinton, both from the South, excluding kind of Virginia and Georgia, which are maybe a bit more purple as states. Um, but it takes time kind of down the ticket. It takes time down the ticket. You know, there are still, it's not until the 21st century that the Republicans actually get hold of kind of states, low state houses and state senates on any level. But I think the seeds are sown in this period. And I think as well, it's important, you know, we think today of kind of liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans. It's in the 1960s and 70s, in these contests about civil rights, white Southerners and African Americans, that I think that polarization and that kind of ideological sorting in political science terms really takes hold in a more meaningful way. And the idea of a broad tent party that has, you know, liberals to conservatives within starts to evaporate into more what we see today.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question. There's a pops up to gazump my question, but we have Callum asking the question: does religion play a role in the
Mm,
transition, such as the evangelical Christians in the Republican Party?
mm.
So really, is there more to it than obviously race is an important factor to you, but are there other things going on, such as
Yeah, yeah,
religion?
yeah. So I think religion, I think when we think of the GOP today, we think of, you know, the religious right and kind of, I'm not going to say pro-life, but anti-choice politics. And in reality, as you know, Jim, that's more of a product of the 70s and 80s, the late 70s into the 80s, you know, your Jerry Falwells, the moral majority, post the Roe decision. That's where a lot of that comes from. Religion is part of the story in the sense that kind of conservative Catholicism and conservative Protestantism in certain veins are there. I also think, and I expand about a bit on this in the book, there's kind of a labor aspect to this as well. Is a lot of what ties the kind of the Goldwater wing together is real hostility to labor unions, real belief in kind of right to work laws, so against kind of closed shop. That's an important aspect that binds a lot of it together, as does, you know, most Americans are anti-communist, but the real kind of virulent John Birch society anti-com, you know, the kind of anti-communism that leads to Eisenhower being labeled a communist, that also holds elements of the more extreme right of the Republican Party together. So religion is there. It's not something I focus on to a massive extent. I will say that, but it's bubbling around in the background and becomes more of a story for the GOP after Roe and after kind of that abortion and gay rights becomes kind of the social issues that they're focusing on more than race and communism. But I do think it's important to talk about the kind of anti-communist framework and also the kind of anti-labor politics that holds a lot of it together as well.
Because obviously, I'm thinking obviously Pat Buchanan's '92 speech and
Yeah, yeah.
the culture wars. It's all, you know, coming to fruition there. I mean, I've still got loads of questions. Also, come stuff.
And at 92 RNC, Reagan does a fake Lincoln quote,
Does
just as an
he?
aside. Yep.
Does he really?
Yeah, the Lincoln quote he uses is completely. It's one of those that everyone's like, well, you know, the whole Marx never said that. Well, Lincoln never said that. Anyway, I digress. That's one for you to investigate, Jim.
I will investigate that. That's going to be that is. Again, I've got so many things. I think this. I wanted like the typical selfish academic thing about something I'm currently looking at. Um, how deep was this change in the Republican Party in terms of the takeover, if you will? and the change and the realignment of it. Because I'm just thinking that if you look at, say, I know it's outside of what you've done, but I'm interested in the background. So, say the 1976 Republican primary,
Yeah.
national polling had Gerald Ford among Republican voters as the overwhelming preference, apart from briefly, like end of 75, beginning of 76. And the first time 75 was so you had Ford, Reagan, Rockefeller, and someone else, I think Connolly, and Reagan was at like 33%, and it was like Ford at 24%. And then in the beginning of 76, there was a poll where just Reagan and Ford, Reagan was marginally over Ford. But after that point, it's Reagan when it's Reagan versus Ford to get the nomination. Ford is often two-thirds of the national Republican
Mm,
voter being polled, the choice, yet Reagan's running in close in the primaries. So in terms of this realignment to do with race,
mm.
and among other things, but especially in your opinion, are you seeing it in terms of is it an activist, like hardcore base intensity thing driving it, or is it the broad? Am I making sense? Is it
Yeah, yeah, I get what
what?
you
How
so
deep is this
yeah, yeah, yeah,
realignment?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, I think it's, I did a book talk on Monday and a similar, thing came up about, well, I don't remember, so in fact, we say, I don't remember race being kind of the motivating kind of, the motor of kind of George Herbert Walker Bush or W. Like it doesn't feel front and center. I would point out kind of like the Willie Horton campaign, and then I would argue that kind of race is always in the background of kind of Republican politics. It's just I think the key first thing I'd say is it becomes coded, right? So you're not explicitly like Republicans I talk about the early 60s in the South are explicitly saying they're pro segregation, right? The minute you get Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, you can't say that because it doesn't work, right? So you're talking about busing, you're talking about local control of schools, you're talking about welfare handouts, etc. Big government, federal intervention. Those are all racially coded terms, and both Ford and Reagan are very Reagan, the Cadillac driving welfare queen, right? That is a inherently coded, racially coded thing. Ford, I mean, I have a little bit of Ford in there. Ford is actually very comfortable to tap, like Eisenhower, to tap some of these kind of pro-Confederate sensibilities. He gives Lee his citizenship back. He goes to the ceremony at Arlington House when Lee gets his citizenship and celebrates Lee in similar terms as Agnew. He does this cruise in down the South and meets with George Wallace and there's a Dixieland band. And so, he's maybe, he's clearly a moderate in comparison to a Nixon or a Reagan, but he is also taking advantage. And that's why I think actually, if you want, Goldwater kind of fires the starting pistol, but I think the one who kind of takes the GOP over the line to being a party firmly on the right, firmly winning white support, right, is Nixon. LBJ is the last Democrat presidential nominee, as far as I'm aware, to get a majority of the white vote. So, there is clearly something that happens here. And then the future, your Fords and your Reagans and your Bushes, they don't need to talk about it because they've already built on that success. They've already got those foundations laid by your Goldwaters and your Nixons that have built. But I do take your point, and I think I see in about Civil War memory, but also in kind of shaping Republican Party policy. I do think it's often kind of if you've got the National Party at the top and you've got grassroots activists at the bottom. I think it's these intermediaries in the middle. So it's your kind of state level politicians, or it's your state party chairman, or it's someone who works for the RNC. I think they're the ones that set the terms for Civil War memory. And I also think they're the ones that set the terms for where the party. So a really important figure in my early chapters of my book is William Miller, congressman from New York, but he's Republican Party chairman. Doesn't seem that sexy, but he decides that more funding is going to go to the South than anywhere else, right? So it's those intermediaries to answer the kind of key part of the question. National figures are obviously important. You need that grassroots base, often kind of quite derogatory referred to as little old ladies in tennis shoes, but little old ladies in tennis shoes got Goldwater the nomination. But I think it's those intermediary kind of they can be kind of leading journalists or kind of state party officials. I think they're the ones that make the difference.
It's just kind of all like almost like and perhaps like your extra party.
Yeah, yeah,
Which is
yeah.
also the people, you call them the anti-choice, groups and the religious organisations and the direct
Well,
mail lists and so
well,
on,
that's Pat
the think
Buchanan.
tanks and
That's where Pat Buchanan fits,
yeah.
right? Like he's perfectly comfortable. Pat Buchanan pops up in my book. He's a a speechwriter for Nixon. He's Nixon's kind of conservative speechwriter. He does loads of research into Lincoln and Civil War memory to bring into speeches.
Mhm.
Interestingly, in '68.
Mm.
So anyway, that's just an aside. But
Yeah.
yeah, but Pat Buchanan is exactly that kind of figure, that kind of intermediary figure.
It's interesting to look at Republican politics, how people just keep coming back. So look at like the people around Nixon the 40 years, they just keep coming back.
Never go
Um,
away. Well,
yeah, I was
Don,
writing about looking some documents from about Cheney as chief of staff, just as it is now that Cheney had died.
yeah,
I was like, amazing how long have been around. Anyway, I won't keep you any longer, Tim. That's absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed that talk. And as I warned earlier, when I press leave, we all leave quite abruptly. So thank you again for joining us at YSJ. Fantastic talk, and hopefully do something again soon. So
yeah.
okay,
Thank you all so much for coming. As I said, the book is there. Please do get it. Please do read it. Please do let me know what you think of it. But thank you for inviting me, Jim, and thank you all for coming along and listening.
okay, cheers, Tim. Great stuff. Thank you.